Ordered, the defendant shall be incarcerated in the Department of Corrections for the rest of her natural life with no possibility of parole.
It started with a photograph, a single image recovered from a digital camera that would unlock one of the most disturbing murder mysteries in recent American history. What investigators found in that deleted file wasn't just evidence of a relationship gone wrong. It was the final moments of a man's life captured in time, leading them straight to the woman who claimed she loved him. Jodi Arias' name would become inseparable from obsession, manipulation, and a trial that captivated millions. Jodi Arias was born in 1970, growing up in a middle-class family in Northern California. She moved frequently during her childhood, eventually dropping out of high school to pursue photography and work in the service industry. Those who knew her described someone who could be charming and creative, but also intense and unpredictable. She worked as a waitress when she met Travis Alexander at a business conference in Las Vegas in September 2006. The attraction was immediate, and despite living in different states, they began a relationship that would ultimately end in tragedy. Travis Victor Alexander was 30 years old, a motivational speaker and salesman living in Mesa, Arizona. He was deeply involved in his Mormon faith and known for his charisma and ambition. Friends saw him as someone destined for success, a man who inspired others and maintained strong connections within his community. But behind the public image, his relationship with Jodi was growing increasingly complicated. The two dated seriously for several months before breaking up in June 2007, yet neither seemed able to completely let go. Even after their official breakup, Jodi and Travis continued an on and off relationship that friends later described as volatile and consuming. Jodi moved to Mesa to be closer to him, taking a job and integrating herself into his world. But Travis had started dating other women, something that appeared to fuel Jodi's jealousy and desperation. Text messages and emails between them revealed a relationship marked by passion, but also conflict and control. Travis confided in friends that he felt trapped, that Jodi's behavior had become overwhelming. Yet he continued to engage with her in ways that kept the connection alive. On June 4th, 2008, Travis was found in his Mesa home by concerned friends who hadn't heard from him in days. The scene they discovered was horrific. Travis had been attacked in his own bathroom, his body left in the shower. The violence was extreme and deeply personal, leaving investigators to believe this was no random act. This was someone who knew him, someone who had access to his home, someone driven by rage or desperation. Attention quickly turned to Jodi Arias. Initially, she denied being anywhere near Arizona at the time, claiming she had been driving to visit another man in Utah. But physical evidence told a different story. Investigators recovered a digital camera from Travis's washing machine, and inside were deleted photographs taken on the day he was killed. Some showed Travis in the shower, alive and unaware. Others, taken just minutes later, captured chaotic images, signs of a violent struggle. And there, in the metadata and the fragments of recovered files, was the timeline that placed Jodi at the scene. When confronted, Jodi changed her story. First, she said she wasn't there. Then she claimed two intruders had broken in and attacked Travis while she barely escaped. Finally, in a version she would carry into court, she admitted she had taken his life, but insisted it was self-defense. She painted a picture of an abusive relationship, claiming Travis had been violent and that she feared for her safety. Yet the evidence suggested something else entirely: a planned visit, a confrontation that escalated, and a level of violence that prosecutors argued went far beyond self-preservation. The trial began in January 2013 and became a media sensation. Jodi took the stand for 18 days, offering detailed and often conflicting accounts of her relationship with Travis and the events leading to his death. Millions watched as she answered questions, cried, and maintained her claim of self-defense despite mounting evidence to the contrary. Prosecutors presented a case built on forensics, digital records, and witness testimony that portrayed Jodi as obsessive, manipulative, and capable of extreme violence when faced with rejection. In May 2013, the jury found Jodi Arias guilty of first-degree murder. They determined that the act was premeditated, that she had traveled to Arizona with the intent to harm Travis Alexander. The sentencing phase stretched on for years, with mistrials and appeals delaying a final resolution. Ultimately, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jodi Arias remains behind bars today, her name forever linked to a case that exposed the darkest possibilities of obsession and control. The question that haunted the trial still lingers. Was this a desperate act of self-preservation, or was it the final, irreversible act of someone who couldn't accept that the relationship was truly over? She told everyone who would listen. Friends, family, police officers, even strangers heard Jennifer Skipsey's warnings that the man she loved might one day take her life. Her voice was captured on recordings, her fears documented in messages, her pleas for help echoing through 2 years of escalating terror. When she was found in the ashes of a burned cottage in Palo Alto, those who knew her weren't surprised. They were heartbroken that all those warnings hadn't been enough to save her. Paul Zumot, who went by the nickname Bulos, was in his late 30s when he met Jennifer Skipsey in 2007. Details about his earlier life remain largely private, but what became clear through court testimony was a pattern of behavior that those closest to Jennifer came to recognize as dangerous. The relationship between Paul and Jennifer lasted 2 years, a period marked by volatility, control, and repeated threats. Friends would later describe a man who couldn't accept boundaries, who responded to conflict with intimidation, and who made Jennifer believe that leaving him would come with consequences. Jennifer Skipsey was 29 years old, working as a real estate agent in the competitive Bay Area market. She was building a career and maintaining connections with people who cared about her well-being. But her relationship with Paul consumed much of her energy and attention. Those who knew her watched as the relationship deteriorated, as arguments became more frequent and Paul's behavior grew more troubling. Jennifer confided in multiple people that Paul had threatened to harm her, that she feared what might happen if she stayed. 7 weeks before her death, she recorded a message for friends, a chilling premonition in which she warned that staying with Paul could lead to something terrible. By October 2009, Jennifer had made the decision to leave. She told Paul the relationship was over and that she intended to report his behavior to authorities. It was the kind of declaration that should have marked the beginning of freedom, the first step toward reclaiming her life. Instead, it became the trigger for the violence she had long feared. On October 15, 2009, inside the cottage they shared on Addison Avenue in Palo Alto, Paul strangled Jennifer to death. The act was brutal and personal, carried out in the home where she should have felt safe. But Paul didn't stop there. After taking Jennifer's life, he left her body in the cottage and drove to San Jose to attend a court-mandated domestic violence class, an irony that wouldn't be lost on prosecutors when the case went to trial. When he returned, he poured gasoline over Jennifer's body, turned on the stove gas, and set the cottage on fire. The plan appeared designed to destroy evidence, to make Jennifer's death look like an accident, or to obliterate any trace of what had really happened. Neighbors noticed smoke and acted quickly, using garden hoses to extinguish the flames before a gas explosion could occur. Their intervention preserved crucial evidence that would later help investigators piece together the truth. When authorities arrived, they found Jennifer's body inside the burned structure. A medical examination revealed injuries to her throat consistent with strangulation, proving she had been killed before the fire started. Investigators began building a case against Paul, compiling text messages, phone records, witness testimony, and forensic evidence. The picture that emerged was one of premeditation and intent, of a man who had killed his girlfriend and then tried to cover up the crime through arson. Paul Zumot was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and arson. His trial in 2011 captivated the community, with prosecutors presenting the mountain of evidence against him. Witnesses testified about the threats Jennifer had endured, the recordings she had made, and the fear she had expressed in the weeks leading up to her death. The jury deliberated and found Paul guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 33 years to life in prison, and Jennifer's loved ones believed justice had finally been served. But the legal battle wasn't over. Paul appealed his conviction, arguing issues with evidence disclosure and the handling of certain testimony. In 2020, a federal judge overturned the conviction and granted him a new trial. The decision devastated those who had fought for justice for Jennifer, forcing them to relive the trauma as prosecutors prepared to try the case again. The retrial was delayed for years as evidence was gathered and witnesses located. In October 2025, 16 years to the day after Jennifer's death, a new jury heard the evidence. Prosecutors once again laid out the history of abuse, the threats Paul had made, and the deliberate actions he took to end Jennifer's life and conceal his crime. The jury deliberated for 2 days before reaching their verdict. Paul Zumot was found guilty of first-degree murder and arson for the second time. He now awaits sentencing and faces life in prison. Jennifer Skipsey told anyone who would listen that she was in danger. Her warnings were documented, recorded, and remembered, yet they weren't enough to protect her from the man who refused to let her go. Her story serves as a painful reminder that the most dangerous time for someone in an abusive relationship is often when they decide to leave. She was wiping down the bar, serving drinks, exchanging friendly words with regulars on what should have been an ordinary Saturday evening. The Cayley house was the kind of neighborhood spot where everyone knew your name, where Irish music played and stories were shared over pints. Sarah McNally had worked there for years, building relationships with customers who became friends. She had no reason to expect that the man walking through the door would turn her workplace into a crime scene that would haunt everyone who witnessed it. Marcin Pieciak was 37 years old in the spring of 2024, living in New York City and navigating the end of a relationship that he clearly couldn't accept. Little is publicly known about his background or what brought him to the United States, but what became clear through court proceedings was a man unable to process rejection, unable to let someone he claimed to care about simply walk away. His relationship with Sarah McNally had been deteriorating, and Sarah had made a decision that millions of people make when a relationship no longer serves them. She was planning to leave New York and return home to Ireland. Sarah McNally was 41 years old, an Irish native from County Longford who had spent roughly a decade building a life in Queens. She worked as a bartender at the Cayley House in Maspeth, a position that put her in daily contact with a community that valued her warmth and professionalism. Friends and family described her as someone who lit up a room, who made people feel welcome, who had dreams of eventually returning to Ireland to be closer to loved ones. That dream was becoming a reality, and she had begun making plans to relocate. For Sarah, it was a hopeful new chapter. For Marcin, it was apparently unacceptable. On the evening of March 30th, 2024, Marcin entered the Cayley house while Sarah was working her shift behind the bar. Patrons were scattered throughout the establishment, enjoying drinks and conversation in the relaxed atmosphere the bar was known for. Surveillance cameras captured what happened next, footage that prosecutors would later describe as deeply disturbing and impossible to watch without feeling horror. Marcin approached Sarah from behind the bar, and without warning, he began stabbing her. The attack was swift and brutal. Marcin stabbed Sarah 19 times, targeting her neck, back, and chest with a level of violence that left no doubt about his intent. The wounds were catastrophic. Her spine was severed, her carotid artery damaged, and the sheer number of strikes suggested rage that went far beyond a momentary loss of control. Sarah had no opportunity to defend herself, no chance to escape. She collapsed behind the bar as patrons and co-workers watched in shock, unable to process what was unfolding in front of them. After stabbing Sarah, Marcin turned the knife on himself. He cut his own throat multiple times in what prosecutors believed was an attempt to end his own life. But a bar patron intervened, physically restraining Marcin and preventing him from leaving the scene or causing further harm. When police arrived moments later, Marcin emerged from the bar, still holding knives. Officers quickly disarmed and arrested him, while paramedics rushed Sarah to Elmhurst Hospital. Despite their efforts, she was pronounced dead from her injuries. The woman who had simply wanted to go home to Ireland would never see her family again. Marcin Pieciak was charged with second-degree murder and weapons possession in Queens Criminal Court. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Surveillance footage, eyewitness testimony from multiple patrons, and the physical evidence of 19 stab wounds inflicted in a public space. As the case moved through the legal system, prosecutors presented the attack as premeditated and personal, driven by Marcin's inability to accept that Sarah was leaving him and moving back to Ireland. The relationship had been strained, and rather than let her go, Marcin chose violence. In October 2025, Marcin entered a guilty plea to first-degree manslaughter as part of a negotiated agreement. By pleading guilty, he avoided a murder trial and the possibility of a longer sentence. But he also acknowledged responsibility for taking Sarah's life. On November 21, 2025, a Queens Supreme Court judge sentenced him to 24 years in prison, followed by 5 years of post-release supervision. During the sentencing hearing, the judge and prosecutors described the assault in stark terms: horrifying, violent, unprovoked, and captured on video for all to see. Sarah McNally's family, many of whom attended the sentencing remotely from Ireland, spoke about the lasting grief and trauma caused by her senseless death. District Attorney Melinda Katz condemned the killing, emphasizing that no one should lose their life simply for wanting to end a relationship or pursue a different future. The community at the Cayley house mourned the loss of a beloved bartender, and the bar itself became a reminder of how quickly violence can shatter safety. Marcin Pieciak is currently serving his sentence in a New York State prison. Sarah McNally's story stands as a painful reminder that for some, the decision to leave is met not with acceptance, but with fatal consequences. Her life was stolen in front of witnesses, in a place where she should have felt safe, by a man who refused to let her choose her own path. The bedroom door opened in the middle of the night, and in those seconds before anyone could fully wake, lives changed forever. A man who couldn't accept that a relationship had ended brought a knife into a home where children slept beside their parents, where an elderly woman rested in another room, where the word family should have meant safety. What Larry Roy did on that May night in 1993 would earn him a place on death row and a nickname that still echoes through Louisiana courtrooms decades later. Larry Roy was born in November 1960, growing up in Louisiana during a time of social change and economic uncertainty. Details about his early years remain largely private, but by his early 30s, he had entered into a relationship with a woman named Sally Richard. Sally had 2 young sons from a previous marriage to Freddie Richard Jr., and for a time, Larry became part of their lives. But relationships built on unstable foundations rarely last, and when Sally decided to end things with Larry and reconcile with her ex-husband Freddie, Larry's reaction would prove catastrophic. Sally Richard had made a choice that millions of people make every year. She decided to give her marriage another chance, to reunite her family, and to move forward with the father of her children. Freddie Richard Jr. was 33 years old, working to rebuild his life with Sally and their 2 sons. The family lived in Cheneyville, a small community in Rapides Parish where neighbors knew each other and violent crime felt like something that happened elsewhere. Sally's elderly aunt, Rosetta Silas, also lived with the family. At 75 years old, Rosetta represented the kind of multi-generational household common in the South, where family took care of family. Larry Roy couldn't accept that Sally had moved on. In the weeks after their breakup, his behavior suggested someone who viewed the situation not as a relationship ending, but as something stolen from him. On the night of May 3rd, 1993, Larry made a decision that would destroy multiple lives and seal his own fate. He broke into Sally's home in Cheneyville, entering quietly while the family slept. His target wasn't just Freddie Richard. It was anyone who represented the life Sally had chosen without him. Larry went first to the bedroom, where Sally and Freddie slept alongside their 2 young sons, who were around 9 and 11 years old. He attacked Freddie with a knife, slashing and stabbing him repeatedly as the family woke to a nightmare. Freddie fought to protect his family, but the attack was swift and brutal. He died in the bedroom he shared with his wife and children, unable to stop what was happening. The boys witnessed their father's final moments, a trauma that would follow them for the rest of their lives. But Larry wasn't finished. He forced Sally and her sons into the hallway, binding them with cords. Then, in an act that prosecutors would later describe as an attempt to eliminate all witnesses, he slit their throats. Sally and both boys sustained serious injuries, bleeding and terrified, but somehow they survived. Larry left them in the hallway and moved to another bedroom, where Rosetta Silas was sleeping. The 75-year-old woman had no connection to Larry's grievances, no role in the breakup that had triggered his rage. Yet he stabbed her to death in her bed, silencing an innocent life simply because she was there. When Larry finally fled the scene, he left behind carnage that shocked even seasoned investigators. 2 people were dead, and 3 others were critically wounded but clinging to life. Sally and her sons managed to escape the house and summon help, their survival a testament to sheer will and fortune. Authorities launched an immediate manhunt for Larry Roy, and he was quickly apprehended. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Survivor testimony, physical evidence at the scene, and his own inability to explain why he had been in that house that night. Larry Roy was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Freddie Richard Jr. and Rosetta Silas. His trial in 1994 drew significant attention in Rapides Parish, with prosecutors presenting a case built on the testimony of survivors and the undeniable brutality of the crime. The jury heard from Sally and her sons, who described the horror of that night in detail. They heard about Rosetta Silas, an elderly woman killed for no reason beyond her presence in the home. The defense offered little that could counter the weight of the evidence. The jury convicted Larry Roy on both counts of first-degree murder. On July 19, 1994, he was sentenced to death, Media outlets began referring to him as the Cheneyville Slasher, a nickname that captured both the violence of his crimes and the terror he had inflicted on a small community. Larry was sent to Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, where he joined death row and has remained for over 3 decades. Larry Roy has filed multiple appeals and post-conviction petitions over the years, seeking to overturn his sentences or delay execution. In 2025, he joined other Louisiana death row inmates in requesting clemency, but those efforts remain unresolved. Surviving victims and their family members have consistently opposed any reduction in his sentence, arguing that the horror of that night demands the punishment he received. Sometimes the most dangerous moment in a relationship isn't the heated argument or the dramatic confrontation. It's the quiet decision to walk away, the moment someone chooses freedom over fear. For Kelsey Polk, that choice came with a price she never imagined paying. Her story is a stark reminder that leaving can be the bravest thing someone does, and tragically, sometimes the most perilous. Roger Earl England was 33 years old in early 2020, living in Knoxville, Tennessee. Little is publicly known about his earlier life or what shaped the man he would become, but what unfolded in January of that year would define him forever. He had recently begun a relationship with Kelsey Polk, a 25-year-old woman he met in Indiana just weeks before. The relationship moved quickly, perhaps too quickly, with the two deciding to live together in Knoxville after knowing each other for barely a month. What seemed like a whirlwind romance would soon reveal itself as something far more troubling. Kelsey Polk was young and building her life, someone with family and friends who cared deeply about her well-being. She had relocated from Indiana to Tennessee to be with Roger, a decision that likely felt hopeful at the time. But within days of moving in together, cracks began to show. The relationship that had started so suddenly was falling apart just as fast. Kelsey made the decision that she needed to leave, to return to Indiana and the life she had known before meeting Roger. It should have been a simple breakup, the kind that happens every day when two people realize they're not right for each other. Instead, it became a tragedy. On January 26, 2020, Kelsey was packing her belongings inside their shared home in Knoxville. She was preparing to leave, to put distance between herself and a relationship that had clearly run its course. Roger watched as she gathered her things, knowing she was walking out of his life. Whatever emotions he felt in those moments, whether anger, rejection, or desperation, culminated in a choice that could never be undone. As Kelsey focused on packing, Roger retrieved a firearm and shot her once in the back of the head. She died at the scene, her attempt to reclaim her independence ending in the most permanent way possible. When investigators arrived, Roger initially denied any involvement. He claimed he didn't know what had happened, that he couldn't explain how Kelsey had ended up with a fatal gunshot wound in their home. But physical evidence and the circumstances told a clear story. There was no sign of a break-in, no indication that anyone else had been present. The shot had come from behind, while Kelsey was vulnerable and unaware. Under questioning, Roger's story began to shift. Eventually, he admitted to police what had really happened. He had shot her, he said, because she was leaving him. It was a confession that revealed not just the act itself, but the motive behind it: control, possession, and the refusal to let her go. A grand jury indicted Roger Earl England on charges of first-degree premeditated murder. The case went to trial, where prosecutors laid out the evidence in stark detail. The medical examiner testified about the nature of the wound, explaining that it was fatal and had been inflicted from behind. There was no struggle, no fight for survival. Kelsey had been shot while her back was turned, in a moment when she had every reason to believe she was safe in her own home. The prosecution argued that this wasn't a crime of passion or a spontaneous act of violence. It was premeditated, a calculated decision made in the moments before Roger pulled the trigger. Roger's defense didn't deny the shooting, but attempted to challenge the claim of premeditation. His legal team argued over elements of intent and planning, trying to create doubt about whether Roger had truly intended to kill Kelsey or if the act had been impulsive. But the jury saw through those arguments. They heard the evidence, considered the circumstances, and reached a unanimous conclusion. In the end, Roger Earl England was found guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison. Under Tennessee law, that meant Roger would need to serve at least 51 years before he could even be considered for parole. For a man in his 30s, it was effectively a sentence that would consume the rest of his natural life. Roger attempted to appeal his conviction, raising questions about trial procedures and jury instructions. But the Tennessee Appeals Court upheld both his conviction and his sentence. The legal system had spoken, and a verdict would stand. Roger Earl England remains in prison today, his name tied forever to the woman he refused to let leave. Kelsey Polk's life was stolen in the final moments of a relationship she had every right to end. Her story is a painful reminder that for too many people, the decision to walk away comes with unimaginable risk. And it raises a question that echoes beyond this single case. How many others have faced that same danger simply for choosing to be free? It was supposed to be their first Christmas as parents. Instead, it became the holiday that shattered a community and launched one of the most infamous murder investigations in American history. Scott Peterson's story isn't just about what happened on one terrible day. It's about how a picture-perfect life can hide something far darker beneath the surface. Scott Lee Peterson was born in 1972 in San Diego, California, into a close-knit family that seemed to embody the American dream. He grew up in a comfortable home, excelled in sports, and carried himself with the kind of easy charm that made him popular wherever he went. After high school, he attended Arizona State University and later California Polytechnic State University, where he studied agricultural business. It was during his college years that he met Laci Rocha, a young woman with a bright smile and an even brighter future. Friends described them as the perfect couple, the kind of pair that seemed destined for a happy ending. They married in 1997 and settled in Modesto, California, where Scott worked as a fertilizer salesman and Laci became a substitute teacher. To those around them, they appeared deeply in love. They bought a home together, talked about starting a family, and seemed to be building the life they had always dreamed of. By 2002, that dream was becoming reality. Laci was 8 months pregnant with their son, whom they planned to name Connor. The nursery was ready, gifts were wrapped, and the holidays were supposed to mark the beginning of their new chapter as parents. But on December 24, 2002, everything changed. Scott reported Laci missing that evening, telling police he had been fishing alone at the Berkeley Marina while she stayed home to walk their dog and bake cookies. He claimed he returned to find her gone, her car in the driveway, and no sign of where she might have gone. Search efforts began immediately, with volunteers combing neighborhoods and posting flyers across the region. The media picked up the story quickly, and soon, Laci's disappearance was national news. At first, Scott appeared to be a distraught husband desperate for answers. He gave interviews, joined search efforts, and pleaded publicly for Laci's safe return. But as investigators dug deeper, inconsistencies began to emerge. His behavior seemed off to those who knew him. He sold Laci's car shortly after she vanished, made unusual financial transactions, and seemed oddly detached during moments when emotion would have been expected. Then came the revelation that would shift the entire investigation. Scott had been having an affair. 4 weeks before Laci's disappearance, he had been seeing a massage therapist named Amber Fry. When detectives contacted her, she cooperated fully, even agreeing to record their phone conversations. In those calls, Scott lied repeatedly, telling Amber he was traveling in Europe and making plans for a future together, all while his pregnant wife was missing and presumed dead. The recordings painted a picture of a man living a double life, one far removed from the grieving husband he portrayed in public. As winter turned to spring, the case took its most tragic turn. In April 2003, the bodies of Laci and Connor washed ashore near the Berkeley Marina, exactly where Scott claimed to have been fishing the day she disappeared. The discovery shattered any remaining hope and confirmed what many had already suspected. Scott was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. His trial became a media sensation. Prosecutors argued that Scott killed Laci to escape the responsibilities of fatherhood and continue his affair without consequences. They presented evidence of his lies, his suspicious behavior, and the damning coincidence of the bodies being found near his fishing location. The defense countered that the evidence was circumstantial, that no murder weapon was found, and that the prosecution's theory relied on assumptions rather than hard proof. The jury disagreed. In November 2004, Scott Peterson was convicted of first-degree murder for killing Laci and second-degree murder for the death of their unborn son. He was sentenced to death, though that sentence was later overturned and converted to life in prison without parole. To this day, Scott maintains his innocence, claiming he is a victim of rushed judgment and public hysteria. But for most, the evidence speaks clearly. Scott Peterson became the face of ultimate betrayal, a man who chose selfish freedom over the family he created. His case remains a cautionary tale about the danger of hidden lives and the devastating consequences when love becomes something disposable. And it left behind one haunting question: how does someone destroy the very thing they promised to protect? The movie had just opened in theaters, her face appearing on screens across America as part of one of the year's biggest films. She was 22 years old with a career beginning to bloom, invitations arriving, opportunities expanding. Dominique Dunne should have been celebrating the kind of breakthrough moment most actors only dream about. Instead, she lay in a hospital bed, never to wake again, because the man she had tried to leave couldn't accept that their relationship was over. John Thomas Sweeney was born in October 1956, growing up during an era when conversations about domestic violence were whispered rather than shouted. By his mid-20s, he was working in the restaurant industry in Los Angeles, moving through a city where dreams were manufactured and fame felt tantalizingly close. He began dating Dominique Dunne sometime in 1981, entering into a relationship that from the outside might have seemed ordinary, but behind closed doors revealed patterns that friends and family would later recognize as dangerous. Dominique Ellen Dunne was 22 years old in the fall of 1982, an actress whose star was rapidly rising. She came from a family deeply connected to Hollywood. Her father, Dominic Dunne, a respected writer and producer. Dominique had appeared in television shows and films, but her breakthrough came with Poltergeist, a supernatural horror film that became one of the biggest hits of 1982. Audiences watched her portray the older sister in a haunted family, her performance earning praise and opening doors to a future that seemed limitless. She was talented, connected, and on the verge of something significant. But her relationship with John Sweeney was unraveling. Friends later testified that the relationship had been marked by jealousy and episodes of violence. There had been prior incidents, moments when John's behavior turned frightening, including an earlier strangulation attempt that Dominique had escaped. She made the decision that so many people in similar situations eventually make. She ended the relationship and asked John to leave her alone. It should have been her right, a choice respected and honored. Instead, it became the catalyst for tragedy. On the evening of October 30th, 1982, John Sweeney arrived uninvited at Dominique's West Hollywood home. She was inside with a friend when John appeared, allegedly wanting to talk about reconciliation. Dominique went outside to speak with him, perhaps hoping to end the conversation quickly and firmly. What began as talking escalated into an argument in the driveway, and then John's hands were around Dominique's throat. He strangled her with such force that she lost consciousness and collapsed to the ground. When police arrived at the scene, John reportedly made a statement that would haunt the case. "I killed my girlfriend, and I tried to kill myself." It was a confession delivered in the immediate aftermath, before lawyers could advise silence, before the full weight of what he had done could be processed. Dominique was rushed to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, but the damage to her brain from oxygen deprivation was catastrophic. She never regained consciousness. For 5 days, her family maintained vigil at her bedside, hoping for a miracle that never came. On November 4th, 1982, Dominique Dunne was pronounced dead at 22 years old. John Thomas Sweeney was arrested and initially charged with first-degree murder. The case drew immediate media attention, not just because of Dominique's rising fame, but because it highlighted issues of domestic violence that were beginning to enter broader public consciousness. Prosecutors prepared to argue that John had killed Dominique deliberately, that the act of strangulation until unconsciousness demonstrated intent and premeditation. But during pretrial proceedings, the charges were modified to allow jurors to consider lesser offenses, a decision that would later draw fierce criticism. The trial began in 1983, with John's defense team arguing that the death was the result of a passionate argument gone wrong, not premeditated murder. Prosecutors attempted to introduce testimony from one of John's former girlfriends about his history of violence, but the judge barred this evidence, limiting what the jury could hear about his patterns of behavior. On September 21st, 1983, the jury reached a verdict. They acquitted John Sweeney of second-degree murder, but found him guilty of voluntary manslaughter. He also received a misdemeanor assault conviction for the prior attack on Dominique. The judge sentenced John Sweeney to 6.5 years in prison, the maximum allowed for manslaughter, plus 6 months for the assault charge. But under California's parole system, he served only about 2.5 to 3.5 years before being released. The verdict and sentence sparked immediate outrage. Dominique's father, Dominic Dunne, publicly condemned the outcome as an injustice. writing extensively about the case and advocating for reforms. Her mother, Ellen Griffin Dunn, co-founded Justice for Homicide Victims, an advocacy organization supporting families devastated by violence. Even Judge Burton Katz, who presided over the trial, later expressed regret about how the case was handled, particularly the exclusion of evidence about John's violent history. The Dunn family's grief was compounded by the sense that the legal system had failed to deliver appropriate accountability. John Thomas Sweeney walked free after serving minimal time for taking a young woman's life, her promising career extinguished before it truly began. He was America's golden boy, a football legend whose smile lit up television screens and whose success seemed untouchable. But in one single night, that carefully built image came crashing down, replaced by accusations so dark they would divide a nation and redefine how the world viewed celebrity, justice, and race. O.J. Simpson's fall from grace wasn't just a trial. It was a cultural earthquake that still reverberates decades later. Orenthal James Simpson was born in 1947 in San Francisco, California, into a working-class family. He grew up in the Potrero Hill neighborhood, overcoming childhood rickets and poverty to become one of the most electrifying athletes America had ever seen. At the University of Southern California, he dominated college football, winning the Heisman Trophy in 1968. His professional career with the Buffalo Bills cemented his legendary status, breaking records and earning him a place in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. But O.J. wasn't content with just being a sports icon. He crossed over into acting, appearing in films and commercials, becoming the friendly face of Hertz rental cars, and building a brand that made him beloved across racial and cultural lines. In 1985, he married Nicole Brown, a beautiful young woman he had met years earlier while still married to his first wife. They had 2 children together and seemed to live a glamorous life in Los Angeles, filled with wealth, fame, and privilege. But behind closed doors, the marriage was troubled. Nicole reported incidents of physical harm to police multiple times, documenting a pattern of control and anger that contradicted O.J.'s public persona. Friends and family witnessed the volatility, but the couple stayed together for years before finally divorcing in 1992. Even after the separation, their relationship remained complicated, marked by attempts at reconciliation and continued conflict. Then came a night that changed everything. On June 12, 1994, Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ronald Goldman were found deceased outside her Brentwood condominium. The scene was horrific, both victims having suffered numerous wounds. Investigators quickly focused on O.J., noting his history with Nicole, his lack of a solid alibi, and physical evidence that seemed to connect him to the scene. When police arrived at his estate to question him, they discovered blood in his Ford Bronco and a bloody glove on his property. Instead of cooperating, O.J. fled. On June 17, 1994, millions of Americans watched in stunned silence as a white Bronco carrying O.J. led police on a slow speed chase through Los Angeles freeways. His friend Al Cowlings drove while O.J. sat in the back, reportedly holding a weapon to his own head and threatening to harm himself. The surreal spectacle played out live on television, interrupting the NBA Finals and transforming a criminal investigation into a national obsession. When the chase finally ended at his home, O.J. surrendered, but the damage to his image was irreversible. The trial that followed became known as the trial of the century. Prosecutors presented what they believed was overwhelming evidence, including blood samples matching O.J.'s at the scene, a pattern of domestic turmoil, and testimony from witnesses who placed him near Nicole's home that night. The defense team, led by attorneys including Johnny Cochran and Robert Shapiro, attacked the credibility of the police investigation, suggesting evidence had been mishandled or even planted. They painted a picture of systemic racism within the Los Angeles Police Department, pointing to Detective Mark Furman's documented history of prejudice statements. The trial exposed deep divisions in American society. For many, particularly in communities of color, the case became about more than one man's guilt or innocence. It represented decades of injustice and discriminatory policing. For others, the evidence seemed clear and the verdict became a test of whether celebrity and wealth could override accountability. The courtroom drama played out daily on television, with every detail dissected and debated across dinner tables nationwide. When the jury delivered its not guilty verdict in October 1995, after less than 4 hours of deliberation, reactions split sharply along racial lines. Some celebrated what they saw as justice prevailing against a corrupt system. Others felt betrayed, believing that fame and expensive lawyers had allowed someone to escape consequences for terrible acts. The Goldman and Brown families were devastated, left without legal justice for their loved ones. Though acquitted criminally, O.J. faced a civil trial brought by the victims' families. In 1997, a civil jury found him responsible for both deaths and ordered him to pay $33.5 million in damages. The contrasting verdicts only deepened public confusion and debate about what really happened that June night. Years later, O.J.'s life continued its downward spiral. In 2007, he was arrested for armed robbery in Las Vegas, eventually serving 9 years in prison before being released in 2017. He lived quietly until his passing in 2024, never publicly admitting involvement in the deaths that destroyed his legacy. The O.J. Simpson case remains unparalleled in its cultural impact. It exposed fault lines in American society, raised uncomfortable questions about celebrity justice, and left families forever scarred by loss. And it presented a question that still haunts us. Can fame and fortune truly place someone above the consequences that ordinary people face? They look like something straight out of a social media dream. The happy family with matching smiles, beautiful home, and carefully curated moments shared online for the world to admire. But behind every perfect photo and cheerful video was a darkness so profound it would shock even the most seasoned investigators. Chris Watts destroyed his entire family, and the question of why continues to haunt everyone who learns his story. Christopher Lee Watts was born in 1985 in North Carolina, growing up in what seemed like an unremarkable middle-class family. He was quiet, reserved, and largely flew under the radar throughout his childhood and teenage years. After high school, he worked in the automotive industry before eventually moving into the oil and gas field. Friends and family described him as soft-spoken, almost passive, the kind of person who avoided confrontation and seemed content to let life happen around him. Nothing about his early years suggested the capacity for what was to come. In 2010, he met Shannon Rzusek in North Carolina. She was his opposite in many ways, outgoing, ambitious, and full of energy. They married in 2012 and soon started building the life they both wanted. Shannon worked in marketing and became involved in a health and wellness company, frequently posting about their family life on social media. They had 2 daughters, Bella and Celeste, and settled in Frederick, Colorado, in a house that represented everything they had worked toward. To anyone watching from the outside, they were thriving. But by 2018, cracks were forming beneath the surface. Financial pressures mounted as the couple struggled with debt and the stress of maintaining their lifestyle. Their marriage grew strained, though Shannon continued sharing upbeat posts online, documenting family trips, the girls' milestones, and her pregnancy with their 3rd child, a son they planned to name Nico. She had no idea that Chris had already checked out of their marriage entirely. He had started an affair with a co-worker named Nicole Kessinger. For Chris, this relationship seemed to represent freedom from responsibilities he no longer wanted. He told Nicole his marriage was ending, that he and Shannon were separating, and that he was ready to start fresh. What he didn't tell her was what he was actually planning. On August 13th, 2018, Shannon returned home from a business trip in the early morning hours. She had been away for days, excitedly texting Chris about their future and trying to work through their marital problems. But when she walked through that door, Chris was waiting. In the hours that followed, he ended her life while their daughters slept nearby. When Bella and Celeste woke up, he loaded all 3 in his work truck and drove to a remote oil site owned by his employer. What happened next is almost too disturbing to comprehend. He placed his wife's body in a shallow grave and his daughters in oil tanks at the site, thinking the remote location would keep them hidden forever. Then he went home, cleaned up, and began acting as though nothing had happened. When Shannon's friend arrived later that day and couldn't reach her, she called police. Chris played the worried husband, giving interviews and pleading for their safe return, all while knowing exactly where they were. But his performance fell apart quickly. Investigators noticed his strange demeanor, his lack of emotion, and the inconsistencies in his story. Surveillance footage showed him loading items into his truck the morning of the disappearance. His co-workers confirmed he had been at the oil site. When police confronted him with mounting evidence, his lies crumbled. Within days, he confessed, leading authorities to the bodies and admitting what he had done. The confession shocked the nation, but it was the details that made the case even more horrifying. Chris claimed he had ended Shanann's life after she harmed their daughters, but investigators quickly determined this was another lie. Evidence and his later statements revealed he had taken all three lies himself: the premeditation, the coldness, and his attempt to play the grieving husband on television made the crime feel even more monstrous. In November 2018, Chris was pleaded guilty to multiple counts and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He avoided the trial that would have forced Shanann's family to relive every horrific detail, though the plea brought little comfort. Shanann's parents have spoken publicly about their loss, their grief, and their struggle to understand how someone they trusted could destroy their entire family. Even from prison, Chris has given interviews, offered explanations, and tried to provide answers for why he did what he did. But nothing he says makes sense of such senseless destruction. He blamed marital problems, financial stress, and his desire for a new life, as if those were justifications rather than pathetic excuses. The truth is simpler and far darker. He wanted a different life and saw his family as obstacles rather than human beings he had promised to love and protect. The Watts case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of appearances and the darkness that can hide behind a smile. Shanann's social media posts, once symbols of family happiness, now serve as haunting reminders of how little we truly know about what happens behind closed doors. And the case left behind one question that will never have a satisfying answer. How does a father look his children in the eyes and choose to erase them from existence? Some relationships end with words, tears, and the slow process of moving on. Others end in ways so calculated and cruel they shake entire communities to their core. Chance Donahoe's story isn't about a moment of rage or a crime of passion. It's about a plan executed with chilling precision and a young woman who never saw the danger until it was far too late. Chance Donahoe was born in 1991 and grew up in South Carolina, living what appeared to be an ordinary life in a small southern community. He was known to friends and family as someone who could be charming when he wanted to be, but also someone who struggled with controlling his temper and accepting when things didn't go his way. As he moved into adulthood, those traits became more pronounced, particularly in his romantic relationships, where his need for control became increasingly apparent. In his early 20s, Chance began dating Shannon Hyatt, a young woman from the same area who had her whole life ahead of her. Shannon was described by those who knew her as kind, trusting, and full of life. She worked hard, cared deeply about her family, and like many young people, was trying to navigate the complexities of love and relationships. For a time, she and Chance seemed like any other young couple, but as their relationship progressed, warning signs began to emerge. Friends noticed that Chance could be possessive and jealous. Shannon confided in people close to her about arguments and his inability to handle disagreements without conflict. The relationship became increasingly toxic, marked by the kind of emotional turbulence that often signals deeper problems. Eventually, Shannon made the decision that countless people make when a relationship becomes unhealthy. She ended it. She walked away, believing that distance would allow both of them to move forward with their lives. But Chance couldn't accept that ending. While Shannon tried to rebuild her life and focus on her future, Chance became consumed with anger and a twisted sense of injustice. Rather than processing the breakup and moving on, he began planning something unthinkable. This wasn't a spontaneous act driven by a sudden emotional breakdown. This was deliberate, methodical, and carried out with a level of premeditation that would later shock investigators and prosecutors alike. In September 2016, Chance put his plan into action. He lured Shannon to a location under false pretenses, and once she was there, he attacked her. The details of what followed are deeply disturbing, revealing the extent of his rage and his complete disregard for the person Shannon was. He took her life in a manner that showed not just violence, but a calculated cruelty that investigators would later describe as among the most disturbing they had encountered. After ending Shannon's life, Chance attempted to cover his tracks. He disposed of evidence and initially tried to mislead investigators about his involvement. But modern forensic science and determined detective work began piecing together what had really happened. Digital evidence, witness statements, and physical forensics all pointed in one direction. As the investigation closed in around him, Chance's attempts at deception crumbled under the weight of overwhelming evidence. Faced with the reality of what prosecutors could prove, Chance eventually made a decision that would spare Shannon's family the trauma of a lengthy trial. He pleaded guilty to taking her life. In court, the full scope of his actions was laid bare. Prosecutors detailed the premeditation, the brutality, and the calculated nature of his crime. Shannon's family members gave victim impact statements, describing the light she brought to their lives and the void her absence created. Their pain was evident, their grief profound, and their anger justified. The judge sentenced Chance Donahoe to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 31 years. It was a sentence that recognized both the severity of his crime and the devastating impact it had on everyone who loved Shannon. For her family, no sentence could ever truly provide justice or bring her back, but it did ensure that Chance would spend decades behind bars, removed from society, and unable to harm anyone else. Shannon's case became another tragic reminder of a pattern seen far too often. A young woman ends a relationship, exercises her right to walk away from something unhealthy, and pays for that decision with her life. The statistics are staggering and heartbreaking. Too many people, overwhelmingly women, face danger not from strangers, but from those they once trusted and loved. Shannon's story fits into that devastating pattern. One more life cut short, because someone couldn't accept that love doesn't grant ownership. Today, Chance Donahoe sits in prison, his youth and freedom traded for decades behind bars because of choices he made in anger and revenge. Shannon's family continues to grieve, carrying memories of a vibrant young woman whose future was stolen from her. And the community that knew them both was left to grapple with a question that has no satisfying answer. How does someone who once claimed to love another person become the very thing that destroys them? Final reflection. So there you have it. Cases that expose the darkest side of human nature, where love twisted into obsession and rejection became a death sentence. Let's take one final look back at these devastating cases, and I want to hear from you in the comments about which one affected you the most. Jodi Arias traveled to Travis Alexander's home, photographed him in the shower, then attacked him with such brutal violence that the crime scene shocked even veteran investigators. She changed her story multiple times, finally claiming self-defense despite overwhelming evidence of premeditation. The 18 days she spent on the witness stand became a media spectacle, and she's now serving life without parole. What struck me most about this case was how someone could sit calmly in court describing the intimate details of a relationship moments before explaining how she ended that person's life. Roger Earl England shot 25-year-old Kelsey Polk in the back of the head while she packed her belongings to return home to Indiana. They'd known each other barely a month, lived together for mere days, and when she decided to leave, he decided she wouldn't leave alive. He's serving life with no chance of parole for at least 51 years. This case haunts me because it shows how quickly someone can reveal their true nature, how a whirlwind romance can become a nightmare in the time it takes to realize you've made a mistake. Paul Bulow's Zumot is perhaps the most chilling case because Jennifer Skipsey warned everyone. She told friends, she told family. She recorded messages 7 weeks before her death saying she feared Paul might kill her. And still, nobody could save her. He strangled her, set her cottage on fire, attended a domestic violence class while her body lay in their home, then returned to finish covering up the crime. After his conviction was overturned, he was tried again 16 years to the day after Jennifer's death and convicted a second time. The fact that Jennifer knew what was coming and couldn't escape, it is absolutely heartbreaking. Larry Roy, the Cheneyville slasher, committed one of the most brutal crimes on this list. When Sally Richard reconciled with her ex-husband Freddie, Larry broke into their home and stabbed Freddie to death in front of their 2 young sons. Then he slit the throats of Sally and both children, though miraculously they survived. He also murdered Sally's 75-year-old Aunt Rosetta Silas, an innocent woman who had nothing to do with the romantic conflict. He's been on death row in Louisiana since 1994, over 30 years now. The sheer scope of violence, the willingness to attack children and an elderly woman, makes this case particularly monstrous. Marcin Pieciak walked into the Cayley House pub in Queens where his ex-girlfriend Sarah McNally was bartending and stabbed her 19 times in front of customers and coworkers. Sarah had been planning to return home to Ireland, ready to start a new chapter away from their troubled relationship. The attack was captured on surveillance cameras, and he was arrested at the scene. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter and received 24 years. What makes this case so disturbing is how public it was, how Sarah was attacked at work in a place where she should have been surrounded by safety, where witnesses could do nothing but watch in horror. John Thomas Sweeney strangled actress Dominique Dunn in her own driveway, just as her career was taking off. Poltergeist had just opened in theaters, making her face recognizable across America, when John's hands cut off her air supply for minutes until her brain was irreparably damaged. She never woke up. He was convicted only of voluntary manslaughter, served just 2.5 years, and the controversial verdict sparked outrage that continues to this day. Judge Burton Katz later admitted he had regrets about how the trial was handled. This case changed how Dominique's father, writer Dominique Dunn, spent the rest of his life becoming a passionate advocate for victims' rights and criminal justice reform. Scott Peterson reported his 8 months pregnant wife Laci missing on Christmas Eve 2002, claiming he'd been fishing while she stayed home. He played the grieving husband on television while secretly carrying on an affair, lying to his mistress about traveling Europe while his wife's face was on missing person posters nationwide. When Laci and their unborn son Connor washed ashore near where Scott claimed to have been fishing, he was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death, later converted to life without parole. The betrayal in this case is staggering. The picture-perfect couple hiding such darkness, the calculated lies while pretending to search for someone he'd already killed. O.J. Simpson, once America's golden boy, fell from grace in the most public way imaginable when his ex-wife Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ronald Goldman were found brutally killed outside her home. The slow-speed Bronco chase captivated 95 million viewers. The trial of the century exposed deep racial divisions in America and raised questions about celebrity justice that remain relevant today. Though acquitted criminally, he was found responsible in civil court and ordered to pay $33.5 million. Years later, he went to prison for armed robbery in Las Vegas. The case remains one of the most polarizing in American history, with reactions still split along various lines decades later. Chris Watts destroyed his entire family, ending the lives of his pregnant wife Shannon and their 2 young daughters Bella and Celeste. While Shannon posted cheerful family photos on social media, Chris was planning their murders so he could start fresh with his mistress. He loaded his family's bodies into his work truck, disposed of them at a remote oil site, then played the worried husband on television. His confession revealed the premeditation, the coldness, the unthinkable betrayal of looking his children in the eyes before erasing them from existence. He's serving life without parole, and this case became a cautionary tale about how little we truly know about what happens behind closed doors, even in the age of social media. Chance Donahoe pleaded guilty to killing his ex-girlfriend Shannon Hyatt, receiving life in prison with no parole eligibility for 31 years. While details of this case are less publicized than others, it follows the same devastating pattern. A relationship ends, a woman tries to move forward with her life, and a man decides that if he can't have her, nobody will. And finally, Jodi Arias again, because her case was number 1 on our list, the obsessive photographer whose deleted photos became the evidence that convicted her, whose trial became a cultural phenomenon, whose behavior on the stand revealed someone seemingly disconnected from the gravity of what she'd done. Here's what I want to know from you. Which case shocked you the most? Was it the public nature of Sarah McNally's murder at the Cayley house? The fact that Jennifer Skipsey predicted her own death and still couldn't escape it? The betrayal of Scott Peterson playing the grieving husband while knowing exactly where his family was? The unthinkable horror of Chris Watts destroying his own children? Or perhaps Larry Roy's indiscriminate violence against an entire family, including young children and an elderly woman? Which case affected you most deeply and why? Were you already familiar with any of these stories, or were some completely new to you? What patterns did you notice across these cases? Do you think the legal outcomes were appropriate, or do you believe justice fell short in some of these cases? Every single one of these cases shares a common thread. The most dangerous moment in an abusive relationship is when someone decides to leave. Kelsey wanted to go back to Indiana. Jennifer was leaving Paul. Sarah was returning to Ireland. Sally reconciled with her ex-husband. Dominique ended her relationship. Laci was about to become a mother, perhaps making Chris feel trapped. Nicole had divorced O.J. Sean and was working to save her marriage, unaware Chris had already decided to destroy it instead. These victims made choices about their own lives, decisions that should have been theirs alone to make. They chose to leave, to say no, to prioritize their safety or happiness or future. And for that basic human right, they paid with their lives. If this video opened your eyes to the realities of intimate partner violence, please hit that subscribe button. It's completely free, and it helps us continue creating content that sheds light on important cases that deserve to be remembered. These aren't just true crime stories for entertainment. They're cautionary tales, they're tributes to victims whose lives were stolen, and they're reminders that we must do better as a society to protect people who are trying to escape dangerous situations. Hit the notification bell so you never miss when we upload new cases. We've got more stories to tell, more cases that demand attention, more victims who deserve to be remembered as more than just statistics. And if you know someone who might be in a dangerous relationship, share this video. Sometimes seeing these patterns laid out clearly can help someone recognize the warning signs in their own life. Sometimes understanding that leaving is the most dangerous moment can help someone plan more carefully, reach out for help, and protect themselves. The comment section is yours. Share your thoughts, your reactions, your own experiences if you feel comfortable doing so. This community is built on respectful discussion and supporting one another. Let's talk about these cases, what they reveal about human nature, and how we can work toward a world where fewer people have to fear for their lives simply because they want to end a relationship. Thank you for watching this series on the most heinous evil exes in American history. These were difficult stories to research and present, and I know they were difficult to watch. But they're important stories, and the victims deserve to have their stories told. Subscribe, comment, and I'll see you in the next video. Remember, love should never hurt. Rejection should never be a death sentence. And choosing to leave should never cost someone their life. Stay safe out there, everyone.